Please welcome the man, Suge Knight.
Suge Knight.
Suge Knight, everybody.
We just learned that rap mogul Suge Knight has been arrested.
In early 2010s, former NWA members Dr. Dre and Ice Cube announced the development of Straight Outta Compton, a biopic about their famous rap group. The film became a major Hollywood project involving Universal Pictures and legendary producers. The film itself was shot in 2014 and had direct input and on-set involvement from figures linked to Dr. Dre and Ice Cube. The presence of these rap legends and the telling of their story brought others to the set, including Dr. Dre's former friend Suge Knight, the man Dre founded Death Row Records with. On January 29, 2015, several members of the Straight Outta Compton film set were filming a commercial for the movie when Knight came to the film set. Upon arriving on the set, Knight aimed to speak with producer Ice Cube, as Knight wasn't happy about his overall portrayal in the film. However, Knight never got to speak with Cube, as Knight was denied entry by Bone, an associate who was providing security on set. Bone, who had previous issues with Knight, got into a heated argument with Knight, who left under the persuasion of security personnel. After this incident, Knight rang Terry Carter, a mutual associate who was friends with Knight, Dre, and Bone. Carter suggested a meetup between Knight and himself so they could discuss how to smooth things over after the earlier dispute at the film set. At 2:55 p.m., the parties arrived at Tam's Burgers in Compton, California. Knight and Carter arrived in separate vehicles. As they spoke to one another within their vehicles, Bone jumped over a nearby wall and started punching Knight repeatedly through his car window. As this happened, Knight drove off the road and directly into the restaurant's car park, stopping his vehicle. Having been shot several times in November 2014 and had multiple health issues, Knight remained in his vehicle rather than engaging with Bone in a fistfight. Bone was still at Knight's truck when Suge saw an associate of Bone also approaching the back of his truck. As all this unfolded, Carter had got out of his vehicle and approached the duo, unbeknownst to Knight. With Bone's accomplices approaching, Knight's vehicle reversed, hitting Bone directly. However, he also caught Carter with the Ford F-150 as the car accelerated away from the scene. Eyewitnesses at the scene said the truck ran directly over the head of Carter in the process. Knight fled the scene as emergency services responded to those injured in the incident. Despite immediate medical attention, it was too late for Carter. Carter died from his injuries. He was 55 years old. Bone survived with substantial injuries to both his head and foot and would go on to make a full recovery. The next day, after hearing about Carter's death, Knight turned himself into the authorities and was subsequently charged with murder, attempted murder, and hit and run, and held without bail. Initially, Knight pleaded not guilty to the charges laid on him for the entire incident. Early hearings were initially set for March 2015. However, these would soon be delayed multiple times due to health issues for Knight. The trial changed dramatically shortly before recommencing on 20th September 2018, when Knight changed his plea from not guilty to no contest. Knight's charges were reduced from murder to voluntary manslaughter, as well as vehicular assault. Knight was eventually sentenced a month later in the Los Angeles Supreme Court on October 4, 2018, for 28 years in prison and was not eligible for parole until 2034. The death of Carter may have been the final nail in Suge Knight's battle with the law, but much of the incident stems back from one of the mogul's biggest grudges, his feud with Dr. Dre. It was revealed in multiple documents that the only reason Carter was dragged into the incident was because Knight wanted his help to bury the hatchet with Dr. Dre, his former friend and business partner. Knight's feud with Dre was one that formed in the 90s, when Dr. Dre and Knight were co-owners of Death Row Records. The two initially went into business back in 1991 when Knight used strong-arm tactics to break Dre's contract with NWA and Jerry Heller and go into business for themselves. This breakaway deal saw the two form Death Row Records in 1992 and become one of the hottest labels in the rap industry. Dre's 1992 album The Chronic shot the label into the stratosphere and paved the way for the likes of Snoop Dogg and Tupac Shakur to break into the scene. However, growing involvement with West Coast gang violence and infighting within the label saw rifts grow between Knight and Dre. It all came to a head in 1996 when Dre walked away from the label. When Dre walked away from Death Row, he did so leaving all royalties and fees with Knight and Death Row for his previous work. Dre would shortly go on to work with Interscope Records executive Jimmy Iovine to launch his new record label, Aftermath Records. Knight's deep involvement with LA gangs would see him earn short stints in jail for aggravated assaults, whilst the fortunes of Death Row plummeted after the death of Tupac in 1996. The ongoing violence and Knight's troubles with the law pushed Death Row into financial troubles, with the brand and Knight filing for bankruptcy in 2006. The company was officially liquidated and sold off in January 2009. As Knight struggled financially, Dre's profile grew, turning him into one of the most influential figures in the music industry. Alongside being the launchpad and producer for new rap stars like Eminem and 50 Cent, Dre also launched an audio tech venture called Beats Electronics. The demand for Beats, particularly their headphones, became so high that Apple would eventually buy the company from Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine for $3 billion in 2013. Alongside this deal, Dre finally brought his story to the big screen, partnering with Universal Pictures to develop Straight Outta Compton. Knight had not been involved with the film project, but was cited as a character that would be featured in the movie. With both Dr. Dre and Ice Cube working as producers on the movie, word had reached Knight that he was allegedly going to be portrayed negatively in the film. Upon learning this, Knight reportedly rang the film's director, F. Gary Gray, and threatened him. Knight was later indicted with threatening harm in 2017 as part of his criminal trial, although the charges were dropped when he changed his plea in 2018. The new escalation of this feud then reached a new tipping point in August 2014, when Knight was shot at a club. On August 25, 2014, Knight was at a music party hosted by Chris Brown at the Outta Nightclub, when he was shot 7 times. The rap mogul was severely injured, with several blood clots forming as a complication from the incident, a problem that would continue to plague him years after the incident. Despite the public setting of the incident, no one was ever charged with the shooting on Knight. All this heat saw Knight look to change the tone of his feud with Dre. It was why Knight reportedly sought Carter's counsel to act as an intermediary between the two. According to Knight, he had been meeting with Carter daily for the past 3 weeks working on a plan before the incident that resulted in Carter's death. Knight's feud with Dr. Dre gave more than context to a probable cause for the hit-and-run incident to take place. It also became a flashpoint for a civil lawsuit launched by Carter's family on March 3, 2015. The lawsuit cited Knight, but it also took on various parties involved with filming Straight Outta Compton. This included directly listing Dr. Dre and Ice Cube as being responsible for the incident, as well as Universal Pictures for distributing the film. Filed by Carter's widow, Lillian Carter, the lawsuit fired multiple accusations that the producers had direct links to street gangs and that the whole incident was caused by a blood feud between Knight and Dre, a spat that had stemmed for multiple decades. The lawsuit, filed by Thaddeus Culpepper, also a representative of Suge Knight, said that Dr. Dre was responsible for all the issues surrounding Knight. This stemmed back to the initial 1996 split between Knight and Dre when Dre left Death Row Records to form his own label, Aftermath Records. The bad blood stemmed from the business split, suggesting that Dre was meant to pay Knight percentages of deals that he had made thanks to Knight releasing Dre's hit 1992 album, The Chronic. These allegations suggested that Knight was owed money from Dre for several major business deals, including the sale of Beats Electronics to Apple and revenue generated from Straight Outta Compton. In particular, Knight stated that shortly before Dre split from Death Row Records in 1996, the two partners signed a contract giving Knight 30% of Dre's lifetime earnings in perpetuity of leaving the company. By creating this agreement, it was agreed that Dre should have given Knight a substantial portion of all his earnings, including a share of Dre's earnings from Aftermath Records, 30% of Dre's earnings from the Beats sale to Apple, and 30% of Dre's earnings from Straight Outta Compton. Within this lawsuit, it was suggested that Dre, Universal, and Apple deliberately worked contracts to avoid giving Knight a penny of Dre's earnings. Much of this was due to the companies not wanting to be linked back to Knight, who had been portrayed by the media as a promoter of gang violence on the streets. It's claimed that Universal and Apple paid Dre through no less than 12 different bank accounts to hide their payments from Knight and his legal team. Furthermore, it is also alleged that Apple influenced lawyers involved with the bankruptcy process of Death Row Records to ensure that Dre did not hand over $20 million to Knight as part of their 1996 agreement. The spotlight was also shone directly on Universal's role in the film, including the chosen locations for filming and staffing hired on the set. They paid particular focus on Bone, the man directly involved in attacking Knight. The lawsuit alleged that Bone had strong links to street gangs, particularly the Bloods, within the Compton area. So much so that Bone had used his links with the gang to hire multiple gangsters as security for the production of Straight Outta Compton. The claim stated that out of the 300 security personnel Bone hired, over 100 were active gang members. This included the hiring of Jimmy "Knob" Chris as a security guard and an alleged accomplice of Bone in the incident that killed Carter. It was then alleged that Bone also picked filming locations with strong gang activity. The lawsuit also went on to add that both Bone and Chris were armed when on detail and were supposedly carrying guns when Bone attacked Knight in his vehicle. They also accused both Universal and Dre of giving Bone extra protection during criminal proceedings. The lawsuit suggested that Bone was sent by both parties to dissuade Knight by any means necessary. This included making a payment of $300,000 to Bone and $20,000 to take out Knight. Furthermore, it is alleged their legal team secured Bone's legal immunity in exchange for testifying against Knight in the trial. Tam's Burgers was also named as part of the lawsuit. It was alleged by Carter's widow that the area itself is a known black spot for gang activity. Not only that, but the venue had gained the nickname Murder Burger due to numerous gangland shootings taking place in the vicinity of the premises over years. There were also accusations of evidence tampering, with the business supposedly allowing access to crime scenes at any time of day with no checking of who might be walking through sealed areas. Despite the lodging of the lawsuit, most of the defendants, including Dr. Dre and Ice Cube, were cleared on July 3, 2016. In a TMZ report, a judge threw the case out, stating that most of the parties couldn't be held responsible for Knight's actions that day, given his reputation of violence in the past. The family re-lodged their lawsuit against all parties in October 2016. However, an appeals board ruled against them once again in 2018. An appeals hearing was held on July 25, 2018, but judges upheld their original verdict. In the hearing, the court ruled that it is still not enough to permit a judgment that it would be foreseeable that a third party like Knight would harm a mediator at a meeting, particularly one, like Carter, who was well respected by the third party. Whilst most of the parties were cleared of wrongful death in 2018, the civil case was altered. This time, it focused on Suge Knight's involvement in Carter's death. Unlike the initial hearings, the lawsuit against Knight didn't run in conjunction with the criminal proceedings. Instead, it was held on June 22nd. The two-week trial saw all parties give their versions of what played out that day, including testimony from Knight himself. Knight's testimony put a much different spin on how the incident unfolded. He revealed that he had been meeting with Carter for several weeks in the lead up to the incident and wanting to bury the hatchet with Dr. Dre and discussed the use of his likeness within Straight Outta Compton. This was when they agreed to meet again at Tam's Burgers to have another discussion. Knight had already tried to speak with Ice Cube at a film set, but had been interrupted and harassed by Bone and Jimmy Chris, preventing Knight from talking with Cube and leaving abruptly. Whilst meeting with Carter, Knight alleged that Bone and Chris had followed him to the meet with Carter, intending to cause harm. Knight said that Bone was making it clear to him that he was armed when he first approached Knight's vehicle at Tam's Burger before claiming, "I'm gonna kill you," at the driver's window. Knight said that Bone leaned into the driver's window to pull him out of the vehicle as well as remove the keys from the ignition. During the struggle, Knight claimed that Bone knocked the gear stick into reverse. When Knight tried to drive away, he was unaware that the vehicle was in reverse, and the movement caused the driver's side mirror to knock Bone off the vehicle. This contact caused Bone's associate Jimmy Chris, who Knight claimed was armed too, to rapidly approach his vehicle. Allegedly fearing gunfire, Knight switched his vehicle to drive and rammed the accelerator. As the fracas escalated, Carter tripped and fell trying to avoid Knight's vehicle, a moment which Knight reportedly did not see. That was when Knight unknowingly ran over Carter, not knowing he was there. During their testimony, Carter's family requested that Knight pay them $81 million in damages. The amount was quoted by their legal representative, Lance Beringer, stating that he wanted $27 million for his widow Lillian and their daughters Nakia and Crystal. The $27 million was generated by Beringer as paying $1 million to each family member for the years he lost, matched with life expectancy. When summing up the family, Beringer stated that dying on the concrete floor at Tam's Burgers was not a natural death. He was taken from these three women. It was during the closing testimonies that Knight's lawyers tried to paint him as not being the true perpetrator of the incident that day. As reported by Vibe, Knight's lawyer Rob Keener stated that Knight was not challenging the worth of Carter's life, but who was responsible for his death. After the closing arguments, the jury in the trial went to consider their verdict. Amazingly, on June 22, 2022, the jury declared a mistrial after their verdict was classified as a deadlock. Overall, the jury of 12 people was 7-5 in favor of the Carter family. However, California law states that jury verdicts must have a minimum of 9 votes on one side in civil lawsuits to be given an official verdict. Knight's lawyers were relieved with the mistrial verdict, with Knight's lawyer Rob Keener telling Rolling Stone that he finally got to tell his side of the story, and he's appreciative that the facts were sufficient. Despite not getting the payout, Carter's family found a small piece of solace within the verdict. When speaking with Yahoo News, Crystal Carter said, It's unfortunate, but the jury worked very hard. It feels good to know we were the majority. The family said they would continue to explore options, however, no new lawsuits have arisen since then. Despite all that, Carter's family still sought peace, knowing that Suge Knight's actions would see him locked up until 2034 at the very least.